There you are now. Welcome back to the workshop. So in today's episode, it is the final installment of the cylinder head tips and tricks. So we did a couple of videos on this that finished up the last time with the cylinder head going off to get its valve seats cut. Today's job is to install the valves with the new valve springs, collets and top caps. But just before I do that, I'm going to bring you in for a close-up and I'm just going to show you the CNC 3D cut valve seats that we got done and the skim job that we got done on the cylinder head. So you'll have seen in recent videos we have a bridge port in the workshop, but we get another machine shop close to us here to do the skimming for us because they have a really super duper machine and it gives this phenomenal finish here. And for good head gasket sealing, we just go that extra step and get that done. They also have a new 3D valve seat cutter, which actually is a CNC machine, and you can see here the profile of these valve seats. So rather than being just the sort of run-of-the-mill triangle valve seats, these are actually a valve seat profile, so the seat is actually completely profiled. It'll cut these beryllium seats absolutely perfectly, and we also profile the valves as well, so you can see we've got multiple angles on the valve. So this is one of the better flowing seats. Now, because this is a standard cylinder head that we're just reconditioning and upgrading to slightly bigger valves, we didn't go the whole hog and blend the valve seat into the port and go all that way. That would be the next stage on modifying this cylinder head. Also, the next stage on modifying this cylinder head would also be working on these combustion chambers, opening them up, giving them more space to allow more breathing to happen around the valve. But customer wanted a pretty much standard rebuild. We worked to a price and he's going to get a really good setup out of this. So previously you would have seen that we cut all the valve seat heights on this cylinder head. We'll put a link to the video up there in the corner. Now we need to check to see whether we need a shim or not. Now, knowing what I knew at the time, I think I got these fairly close, but it's still something that you need to check. You can't just rely on the measurements I would have taken at the time to be sure, because the valve seats were machined after I machined the valve spring seat heights. Now, I made a very good guess in my head as to how much they would go, and now we can see whether I got that right or whether I got that wrong. So the valve springs we're putting into this cylinder head are a mini spares option. They're a very good valve spring, and the paperwork that comes with the valves from Mini Spares says that on a standard or modified road engine, they need a fitted height of 1.420 to 1.440. That's the running height they give us. So what we need to do now is see what that is. What does that mean? That is the distance between the valve spring top cap when it's in place and the spring seat that we machined before. That's the distance that they want, which is basically how compressed the valve spring will be when the valve is fully closed. In other words, the rocker is fully released off it. How we're going to measure that is, years ago I made up this hardened steel spacer, which has a very specific measurement. It is 14 millimeters wide. So this distance here is 14 millimeters, meaning that I have that as a constant. I put that on and that's going to sit around the valve guide. It's a real tight fit on the valve guide, and it goes down and sits on that spring seat that we machined. It'll turn there and it sits on that spring seat. I have a weaker spring here. This is actually a rocker this is actually a rocker shaft spring, and it sits in the standard road rockers. It's good for doing this job. So we put that on there. Then we get a top cap. Now this can be a little bit of a fiddly job because you've got to hold in the valve spring and then you got to get a collet in there, which can be just a little bit fiddly. And if you get it wrong, the whole lot goes springing across the workshop. And Billy's struggling there, I think, to get an image of this for you. But when I get that in there, I'm going to show you what it is. So let's put that down there now. But it'll show you exactly what it is. So there's our spacer. It's sitting down on the machined seat that we put in there. We've got our little rocker spacer spring in there. We've got our top cap on and our collets in place. So this is holding the valve in the fully closed position. We know this height is 14 millimeters, so we'll write that down on our piece of paper. 14. The next thing we need to do is measure the distance between this and where the valve spring is going to sit on the seat cap. Now, I'll try and show you that. There is two dimensions on this seat cap. There is an outer dimension here, and there's an inner dimension here. This is for the second spring in a double spring setup, and this is for the outer spring in a double spring setup. When mini spares give you the dimension 1.4 to 1.44, it's between there and your spring seat you're trying to measure. Now, the way I do this is with a nice set of telescoping gauges that I have, and they work really well for this job. There is loads of different ways of doing this. You could use something like a verniers caliper, or as I call it, the vernier caliper, but there is some packaging issues about trying to get this in there and get it to work right. You could probably make this spacer higher and it might make it a bit easier to work, but I find that you start running out of room up here and you start trying to measure a very small distance. So I have telescoping gauges, and all a telescoping gauge is a way that you can get a measurement of a inside dimension. These spring, and there is a lock down here at the bottom which hold them in whatever position you find them in. So how it's going to work here is we put them in the springed position. We get down here and we get the telescoping gauge in on to that spot that I showed you before. Now, a couple of things about a telescoping gauge. If you want to do this right, you have to make sure that the gauge is sitting in the right spot, and you also need to make sure that it's standing up parallel. So there is a bit of intricacy to these. A little trick with a telescoping gauge is if you actually put it slightly at an angle and then bring a bit of tension on and then bring it back to the vertical point and out, what that actually does is it'll squash the telescope gauge to the exact dimension. So we now have a really good fit between that and that. So it gives you a good accurate dimension on it. You can then get your micrometer and you can check your telescope gauge with your micrometer, and all you have to do with that is just very simply bring in your telescope gauge. I'll try and get this in a way that you can see it. So basically you want to put the telescoping gauge between the two anvils of the micrometer, bring up the tension of the micrometer, and it'll tell you what that dimension is. So in this case, the dimension on my micrometer reads 22 millimeters 0.36. So 22 millimeters 0.36. So if we add that to our 14, that's going to give us 6, and that gives us 36.36 millimeters. So 33.36, we're in millimeters here, and the measurement Mini Spares gives us is in inches, so we just need to use our calculator to work that out. So 33.36 gives us 1.431 inches. As I said, Mini Spares give us a fitted dimension of 1.420 to 1.440. So we're in at 1.43, so we're actually sitting bang smack on in the middle. Now, that's not just luck. I obviously had a good idea. I've done enough of these cylinder heads, measured the seats, knew I was putting brand new valves in, so I got this very close. If it was a case that the valve had moved up further and that dimension was bigger, let's just say for example it came in at 1.4 or 1.45, say somewhere like that, what we would have to do is we would have to put a spring seat shim in, and I'm going to just grab one here to show you. So that's a spring seat shim. and that there is 4/1000 of an inch shim, and that would sit in underneath the valve spring, and you can put as many of those as you need in to reduce that dimension in there until such a time as your valve spring reads the measurement that you need it to. Now, the reason why I machined those valve spring seats in the first place is 99.9% of the time in the years gone by, when I did a cylinder head like this, there was always the situation where actually the problem was there wasn't enough room. So some valves ended up being that the valve spring seat, well, when the valve was seated, was actually too tight. So it would end up like, say, 1.38 or 1.39 or something like that, which would be no good because you can't add a shim to make that bigger. No matter how many times I drill the hole, it's still too big. So in a situation like this, it's better to actually have a bit of space underneath there. I try where I possibly can on a road cylinder head like this to try and get it as close first time, but I always leave a little bit extra in there. So it's at 1.30. Now, if this was a race engine that was going to be at sustained high RPM all the time, I would actually use valve spring seat shims to get that right on the nose at 1.420 to get myself the absolute spot on dimension. But for a road going head that'll spend most of its time at cruise and the odd spurt up to high RPM, having spring seats at that pressure is fine. To be honest with you, with a fairly standard-ish cam that's going in this, actually having the spring seat pressures down a tiny bit like that will just add longevity to the cam. And I normally actually try and shoot for the bigger dimensions, so I go as close to the 1.4 as I can get it to just give the cam a little bit more life. There's plenty of pressure over the nose and it'll work more than good enough. Next step is I'll measure all the rest of these off camera. No point in boring you with it, and then we'll go over to the Bridgeport and we will start fitting the new valve springs once we're sure of the dimensions. Before I do that, thank you very much to everybody who tunes into the video. You are all most welcome. To everybody who is new to the channel, you are really welcome here too. It's growing every day. I see the subscribers trickling in. So to anyone who's subscribed to the channel in the last couple of days or weeks or months, you are really very much welcome. Also, just to point out, I'm sure some of you have noticed over the last couple of days that we've been playing around with YouTube Shorts. I've stayed away from these a little bit. They're a new enough thing to YouTube, and I've kind of stayed away from them a little bit because I wasn't really sure about them. But the other day, I was doing a little job in the Bridgeport, and I said, I'll just throw one together. And it actually got a really good reaction. Over 1,000 views in 24 hours, and everybody seemed to be really good feedback. I got a good few messages and a good bit of information back that people actually liked it. So what we're going to try and do over the next couple of months is we're going to try and do a wake up with HRE short or something like that. At 9 o'clock each morning we'll throw out a short. So what I've done is over the last couple of weeks, as jobs are going through the shop, I'm just grabbing footage with my phone and I'm giving it up to Billy, and he's going to put it together to try and make you a little bit of a short each morning. It'll be just a minute, and it'll just be a little run of what's going on in the shop, but just to try and bridge that gap, because it seems like more and more it's a video a week now rather than the older format of 2 a week. And I know you guys love the content and you're always giving me good feedback, so I said let's just try shorts for a while. If you guys like the shorts, let me know. I'd really be interested in hearing in the comments what you think of the shorts. Are they interesting, or would you just rather it was all a video each time? It's more just to try and give you a bit of what's going on in the shop as opposed to these more instructional videos about what's happening. So let us know in the comment section below. Do you like the shorts? Is there anything in particular you'd like to see in the shorts? I've already had comments come in on a couple of them. Show us this. Can you give us a rundown on that? So I'm going to add them to the list and crack on with them, but let us know. Don't forget to hit the like button. It really does help get us out there. And as I said, comment, and you're most welcome if you're new to the channel. Right, over to the Bridgeport. I'm going to go and measure these off camera. Then we'll get over to the Bridgeport and we'll get these valve springs fitted. we've done all the valve spring seat heights and they're all within 1,000. So I'm really happy with that. No need for a shim. Well, one shim just on this one, but all the rest of them were good. I'm just putting a little bit of extra oil. I oiled the valve springs, or the valves themselves when I put them in, but also just before I kind of actually put the valve springs in place, I like to do that. Billy gave you a little bit of a shot over my shoulder here of my workflow. So with the Bridgeport, I've had to kind of redo things a bit differently than I would have done them before. So I'm just getting used to a new machine and how it works here, and you know, kind of put things where I want them so that it's nice and kind of easy to get the jobs done. But I'm slowly getting there. I think starting to get a workflow that's good, or it's getting a pattern that's there. So valve springs. Now, Paul, before you put the valve springs in, you got to put. This is a question actually that came up the other day. Which do I use valve stem oil seals, and do I put 8 of them on or 4 of them on? The answer is 4 of them. I only ever put valve stem oil seals on the inlets. I never put them on the exhausts. People asked me recently, why is that? Why do you not put them on the exhaust? Kind of 2 reasons. On a normally aspirated engine, definitely anyway. The truth is that there's pressure in the exhaust, so there's no oil going to be going down the guides. There's not going to be an issue there. We ream our guides, so our guides and our running clearance for our guides is really good. So while a little bit of oil gets down there, which you want that to happen, there's never an excessive amount of oil. However, on the inlet side of an engine, you've got a depression being created inside in the combustion chambers, and that depression is going to lead to a situation whereby you are going to have a draw. Atmospheric pressure is going to be in the rocker cover. It's going to try and push oil down, and in turn, the pushing of that oil down is going to mean it'll go into your inlet. If you get oil into your inlet tract, the best case scenario is just a bit of smoke, but the worst case scenario is oil actually changes the octane rating of your fuel, and in certain circumstances enough oil in there can actually cause detonation to occur, and that detonation could damage pistons, could cause lots and lots of problems. So the truth is that it is much better on an engine to have valve stem oil seals, but they're not necessarily, or on a mini engine, it's not necessarily strictly required on the exhaust side. So I've been doing this for years. I use my Bridgeport as a valve spring compressor. These kind of tools to me have to be ubiquitous. They have to do a bit of everything in the shop. So I just used the quill lock here with my trusty old bit of steel that I made up from my old milling machine that you remember used to be in the corner, and we just pop in our collets here. It holds the valve spring compressed for me, and then I can you know, just let it up, and then the valve spring seats in there perfectly. Slide along to the next one and do the same. Bring your valve spring down. There it is, seating itself. Pop the quill lock on, get your collet, and this is one of the reasons why having the oil in there is great. If you've got a good sticky gear oil, what'll happen is it'll hold the collet in for you, and you don't have to worry about the collet popping out while you're letting the pressure off. You can see it keeps popping away as we go. So next one in place, compress the spring, quill lock on. Get your collet, pop your collet into place, and once your collet is in there, you can take the pressure off. Now sometimes these collets can be a little bit fiddly. If you've got hands the size of mine, they can be a lot fiddly. So a magnetic screwdriver can be a great little aid or a great little trick just to pick that collet back out again. And save you in a situation where, you know, it didn't sit in there right the first time. It is important that you get the collet seated right before you let the valve spring up, because If you don't, what can happen is the collet half sits into place. It'll look like it's seated. And when you start the engine, the collet can dislodge, and then the result in that is going to be a case of probably going to drop a valve, and that will not be a nice situation. Okay, I'm going to continue on here, and I'll see you back in the bench in a minute when I have the rest of these done. Now, we have all the valve springs installed. I'm just putting back on the manifold studs that the customer gave me. I just literally gave them a little wire brush. Liberal soaking of America's favourite Livation, good old WD-40. That just stops any flash rust or any surface rust from forming on the cylinder head between now and when the customer gets it. Beautiful smell. So finishing touch then for the customer, just a little blanking plate that we laser cut. Yes, you heard me, that we laser cut on our laser. Gives him the dimensions of his cylinder head. Gives him, it keeps the surface of the cylinder head clean between now and when it gets transported wherever it's going to go. Keeps the inlets and the exhaust clean. And then we'll put a couple of nuts on there just to hold that plate in place for him, and then that will be that cylinder head done. So from what was a rusty piece of junk that entered the workshop here a couple of weeks ago, we machined all the valve spring seat heights. We repaired a broken stud that was in there. We recut and remachined the thermostat housing so that it'll take a thermostat housing for the customer properly. We had a broken stud here in the front of the cylinder head. We replaced that. Then we went ahead and took out the old bypass waterway, put a bung into that, blocked it up. We had the custom made valve guides that we did here in the shop, put those in, those bronze valve guides, and set them to the right height. We then sent the cylinder head out of the shop and got this surface here skimmed. We checked the combustion chambers, they're 21cc, which is exactly what we want for the customer. We fitted brand new stainless steel EN21 triple collet valves and had 3D profile valve seats made for that. Then we brought the head back here to the shop. We checked our measurements on our valve spring seat heights. We installed our valve stem oil seals, put our springs, top caps and collets in place, gave the cylinder head a really good clean, put on our blanking plate there to keep the cylinder head clean, and that is ready now for collection from the customer. I hope you enjoyed joining us on this little escapade with a cylinder head. We'll see you in the garage for the next one.